Welcome to the book show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Griffin Dunne's memoir of growing up is The Friday Afternoon Club. It has been quite a life. At 8, Sean Connery saved him from drowning. At 13, desperate to hook up with Janis Joplin, he attended his Aunt Joan Didion and Uncle John Gregory Dunne's legendary LA launch party for Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. These are just a few of the stories told in this amazing new memoir. For all of its incredible cast of characters and the jaw-dropping scenes, the book is, at the core, a family story that embraces the absurdities and best and worst efforts of its lovable, infuriating, funny, and moving characters, including our guest for this week's book show, Griffin Dunne. Hello, sir. How are you?
Well, thank you for that. That was nicely described. I like that.
Well, thank you. I love this memoir. It is beautifully done, and I would think, I don't know this to be a fact, but I would think, I mean, living a life is one thing, but to write about it in this way and to share it seems like it would be difficult, especially given the very high ups and the very low downs.
It wasn't difficult in that I dreaded going to work and sitting behind the laptop, or that I dreaded writing it and I'd have sort of a form of writer's block. It was sort of in the highs and in the lows. I sort of, everyone in it, except for my brother, my immediate family, had passed on. And I was, without getting too spooky about it, it was like bringing them back. It was like conjuring them. I could see everything so clearly. My
Mm.
placement of where I was, how old I was, what I felt like. I've been taking notes along the way over the years, should the day come when I did write a book. And it turned out to be a very different book than I imagined in the first place. But I really enjoyed their company, my family. I enjoyed following my mother's childhood and her getting married and her being sick, finding out she had MS and then going through, the toughest part of the book, the life-changing part is sort of at the pulse, I guess, is the murder and then the trial of the killer of my sister. So that was indeed difficult. It was emotionally difficult, but I don't know. I felt compelled. I just wanted to make sure I got it right. And not have it be a pity party. Just when I got to the trial, I wanted it, people are very used to reading about procedurals and things like that. I wanted the horror and the injustice that took place in that trial to speak for itself with as little commentary as possible. So it was that part was difficult, but it was also, I don't know, a calling, not to put too heavy a point on it.
You mentioned that I mean, you had taken notes along the way, but how much did you know? How much was in your head, and how much of it is some degree of research where you go out and say, okay, and that's different from saying, what year did I do this film, or what year did I do that, or where did I move here? But getting it right as far as where
Hmm.
everybody was at any given time.
I had been sort of thinking of the book when I proposed it to the publishers before really beginning in earnest, that it would be sort of a chapters of humorous anecdotes of stories that I've collected about family members and about myself along the way, and having them sort of interlap, sort of very much like David Sedaris's book, We Talk
Right.
Pretty. And but then my editor, a wonderful novelist himself named John Burnham Schwartz, he suggested I do the mundane of writing it in sequence, in order. And I realized as soon as I started, I went, no, I can't. I actually have to start way back. And then it required research and how the Mexican Revolution affected my mother's side of the family and my great grandparents fleeing Pancho Villa on their hot on their heels. They were on the wrong side of that revolution, and the Great Famine in Ireland. You know, my great grandfather coming over and his sort of Horatio Alger story, and and along the way of the people that they married, there was tremendous scandal and abuse, and there was just so much life, on my grandmother's side, my grandfather's side, he's very wealthy, came from a very wealthy family. The family made Griffin wheels. They were wheels on all the trains in America and the Pullman cars. Well, I mean the adultery and the drinking and the stuff that went on in that side of the family, it all just sort of led to my parents and the kind of people and the environment that they were brought up in and the troubles that they inherited and and brought on passed on to their children unintentionally. We all carry generations before us. And I found as I wrote it sequentially that it wasn't about being funny. There were a lot of funny things that happened along the way, but it felt historical to me. It
Mm.
overlaps with World War II, Vietnam, and these moments in history. So I wanted to make sure I had the time right of where the country was in relation to how old my parents were, and then how old I was, and me growing up in LA, in the late 60s and early 70s in Manson, the Manson murders and how that affected my life. And then years later, Sharon Tate, who was killed by Manson's gang, her mother starts a group called Parents of Murdered Children. And when we found ourselves in the courtroom defending the honor of my sister, Doris Tate's group, Parents of Murdered Children, looked after us and came to our trial. So I was kind of stunned as I just kept writing that an enormous amount of incident and history and coincidence and irony.
Griffin Dunne is our guest. The new memoir is The Friday Afternoon Club, a family memoir, very much a family memoir. And in those early days, as I was reading some of the things that happened to you at 8 and 12 and 14 and so forth, a lot of those happened as a result of your father and your father working in Hollywood and where he would be at any given time.
Yeah, he was a very when I was little up until they divorced when I was almost 11. um, my parents were very, very social, driven mostly by my father and his sort of obsession with celebrity. And he was a very funny guy, and my mother was a very beautiful woman, and they were a very elegant couple, and were able to give parties most nights or go to parties that the greatest movie stars of the 40s and 50s and emerging stars like Dennis Hopper and Warren Beatty would be at, and the most powerful studio heads. And you know, they, my father, he couldn't understand what he was doing in that world. Uh, so he would take pictures. He was a very good social photographer and keep them in scrapbooks. And you'd have people like Billy Wilder and other filmmakers, George Stevens, and there'd be David Niven, and it was a pretty classy group. But I was too young to really know who these people were. They just seemed like loud, drunk adults to me. But as I approached, my interest veered toward wanting to be in movies and make movies. I couldn't get over the people that were in our house that I was simply too young to appreciate. Um, and then later, when my aunt and uncle, John Dunn and Joan Didion, became quite well known, they became the Hollywood it couple of the 70s. And by that time, when I knew who Brian De Palma and Paul Schrader and Scorsese and George Siegel and uh, all these great directors, actors, production designers were all friends of my parents, with my aunt and uncle. So um, that's when I was able to sort of take in both. They were almost two different generations of Hollywood.
And you say take it in, but I mean, at no point, I guess it's normal for you, but does it register that to anyone sort of outside of that is a very that's a very different world?
Yeah, I was aware how different it was, particularly when I went to when I went to, my parents sent me to a boarding school when I was
Right.
11 years old, and
Yeah.
it was in Massachusetts, and I grew up in California. And I grew up in a town called Beverly Hills, which the hottest show was the Beverly Hillbillies. To me, it was embarrassing to come from a place like that. So I kept all of that to myself. I kept my background of privilege, and I was embarrassed of it. Then, particularly years later, when I was 18 and I moved to New York to become an actor, I would never tell anyone um, about these sort of stories. It took me. Um, I'd have to be honest with myself. I'd have to say till I was in my 30s till I really appreciated really how unusual that was and how uh, unusual it was to be a kid, like right in the middle of it, just wandering from room to room and sipping grown-ups drinks you know um, and then being a teenager, around these filmmakers in the 70s who made movies that I still think are the greatest movies ever made, and that I would help this carpenter on the deck build a deck for his my aunt and uncle, and that carpenter turned out to be Harrison Ford. So all of these things all piled up. I go, wow, that's pretty unusual. That's pretty interesting, and I think that's around the time I started to think about a book.
There's a moment, and it seemed to me that it tells a lot about you, and maybe it doesn't, but I think given the fact that you tell the story that it must. But you're at that boarding school, which is Fay, right?
Yes,
And they take a picture of a group, and as they're doing it, you give the camera the finger.
yeah.
And no one notices it until much, much later. But that is a moment of, oh, okay. It seems to me that is a you're saying something with that, obviously.
Absolutely, and I think I wasn't overtly rebellious, which made it even more confusing to me why I was 11 years old going to school 3,000 miles away to a very strict all boys school. And as I was emerging, as I was entering puberty. So I think that there was some repressed anger and rebellion there. But there was also, this school was so strict and so oppressive that I developed an art with trying to get away with stuff. I was the sneakiest. It's sort of like, you know, the guy who ends up going to prison on a misdemeanor and then comes out a hardcore criminal. That's what I came out. I went in fairly sweet kid, but I could end up being able to lie like a serial killer, and my pulse never would rise. I was just very sneaky, and it was really important for survival to get away with stuff. So my idea of slipping the finger on getting that into the picture was also inspired by an album cover, which was a really big deal at the time. A group called Moby Grape. They were famous more than their music for giving the finger on their album cover, and everybody wanted that album cover. And the record company stopped making it and tried to get them all back. And I had one with the famous middle finger in it. So I was kind of doing an homage to Moby Grape as well.
You write in the book, after a year of waiting tables, going to open casting calls, and trying in vain to even meet an agent, I began to worry that I'd never, never get a job in show business. So even when you wind up in New York, there's a rebellion even in that, because your father doesn't understand it, and you're trying to figure out what your place is. You know what you want to do, but it's hard to communicate that.
Yeah, it was very unusual too for a lot of actors at that time who were in Los Angeles to leave Los Angeles. I mean, that is the entertainment capital of the world. But it struck me as Los Angeles, Hollywood. I was very kind of, I always loved New York actors. I could tell a New York actor. I knew the difference between an LA actor and a Dustin Hoffman, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro. And I wanted to go where those guys went and get my bones in New York. It was rebellion, but also trying to flee a kind of celebrity obsessed environment of which I was brought up in. That now I talk about, and I mentioned more celebrities than you could shake a stick at in this book.
Well, and talk a little bit about that because as you mentioned before early on in our conversation, your father being celebrity obsessed, your father is Dominic Dunne, so he starts in the business and then later in his life is best known for his work in Vanity Fair. He leaves your mother. He comes out. Well, he is gay. You know that.
Hmm.
He doesn't come out, I guess,
Never did.
officially. And but that is something that you are also working on and with and through. It seems there is a competition, right? There is a dynamic there that is some of it is said, some of it is unsaid, and it also goes on with other members of the family between, say, your father and his brother.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my father and his brother, that was far more intense than particularly my father and I. But I guess it was sort of competitive. I don't know. There was he had a until he got sober and really turned his life around, and he hit rock bottom to come out the man that he was supposed to be. But when he was, trying to find himself, here he is twice my age. I'm trying to find myself. And um, he his sort of, self-destruction and his priorities and his it was baffling to me. Um, um, but as I described him, he was just a work in progress, and as was I.
Career wise, and sometimes in the telling of the story, this, I mean, obviously you're talking about yourself and you're talking about your career and about your life, but there's all that's going on elsewhere in the world and in the family. For you, what did you consider your big break to be of the moment that you were doing what you wanted to do?
I would say that as far as like an extraordinary opportunity that came to me way too easily was meeting John Landis, talking to John Landis for about 15 minutes, not reading or auditioning, and going to my apartment and then being offered the lead in a big movie by a really big director. And going to London on the Concorde, sitting next to Joan Collins, flirting with her on the Concorde. That flight wasn't long enough. Um, and living in London, and that was like, that was my entree. It's like, who's that guy? Oh, that guy's Griffin. That's a weird name. Dunn is his last name. Okay. But that actually led to, oddly, something that was more important to me, that I was much more impressed by, was to be in a play by Wallace Shawn at the Public Theater. All I wanted to do when I came to New York was get a job at Joe Papp's Public Theater. I would look at that place and salivate, that building on Lafayette. There I was in a play every night in Marie and Bruce. So it was like that was a really exciting period where I got both. I got the movie that got respect in Hollywood, but I also got the play. And downtown off Broadway, going out with the actors afterwards, drinking in Phoebe's. That was like going, and most important, I could afford taxis. That was when I thought I really made it.
The film, of course, is an American Werewolf in London.
Yes,
John Landis is the director. John, as you write in the book, John, you call John Landis back. He offers you the role, and as you say in the book, to this day, you have no idea why.
I don't, and I've been asked about that a lot. Even though what I remember in that 15-minute conversation and would come to know is that he does most of the talking. Whatever sentences I got in, I think he liked my cadence because when I look at that movie and I see that, the person that I'm playing, I'm very easygoing. And I think I'm going to take that easygoing guy who's kind of funny, got a wry sense of humor, and I'm going to put him in the most terrifying, ugly, horrific makeup and still make him talk relaxed and be funny and have it be a complete contrast to the way he talks to the way he looks. And I think he thought I could pull that off.
Griffin Dunne is our guest. The new book is The Friday Afternoon Club, a family memoir, and it is published by Penguin Press. At the time of your sister's murder, where were you in your career? You're coming out of what you just described, right? And this is dealing with that, dealing with fame, and then dealing with the death
Yeah.
of the sibling.
On top of that, the way I finally got acting, it's a longer story for another time. The way I got into acting after all these auditions that I blew and all these, waiting on tables and all these other jobs, I got a job because I actually produced a feature film for a studio and gave myself a small part in the movie. And the part got a lot of attention. So on top of that, I'd also produced movies. I produced two movies at that time, and I was appearing in a play by Ted Talley, who had also made play I was in earlier called Coming Attractions. That was about a guy who killed celebrities. That was the very same time I was doing that play when Mark David Chapman killed John Lennon. And ours was a satire, and that was real life. So there was a lot going on. And I was doing this other play and hanging out after performances at an actor's bar that any actor around my age would remember fondly, called the Cafe Central. And every actor in the world would go there afterwards. And there were no paparazzi. There was no nothing. It was an amazing haunt that anyone could go, no matter how famous or what they were doing, and not be bothered. It was the 80s, and everybody was pretty coked to the gills, myself included. And then I woke up to my father calling me the crack of dawn, that he'd just spoken to my mother, who just was visited by a homicide detective to give her the news that Dominique, that she'd been strangled. So there was a lot going on. There was a lot, and there was a lot going on in her life. And one of the things I talk about in the book, and I think about all the time, is she was a really good actress. And unlike me, who took me a long time to get on my feet to get a decent job, she came out of the gate. She said, "I want to be an actress." Boom, she gets the part. Her talent was so clear. There was no self-consciousness about her that I certainly suffered from. So we would talk about what we would do. We really believed, and I still believe, we would have been a pretty good brother and sister act. We always loved those sibling combinations and thought we would, end up like that as well.
I should mention of course, she appeared in Poltergeist. I mean, her career was really starting to.
It was just like mine.
So 1982, and voluntary manslaughter is the charge
Yeah.
against John Thomas Sweeney, and serves 3.5 years in prison. Even in reading the story and knowing the story, you just keep saying to yourself, how does that happen?
None of us knew anything about the judicial system, but we came from, and this is an entirely new, rather intimidating environment. But it became pretty apparent to us that a courtroom is no different than a stage or a theater, and that there's acting going on. And with acting goes lies and performance and ego and petty rivalries. And, the judge, for whatever reason, hated our district attorney. That was very clear in the decisions that he made. The defense lawyer, I guess you would call it, doing his job. His job was, by protecting his client, defending his client, meant he had to defame the very person that he killed. And he came up with all sorts of crap about her, all sorts of crap, just lies. that the jury would hear to taint her. It's called blame the victim. And there were witnesses that were called. Oh, that one in particular that Sweeney had put in the hospital with broken nose and broken eardrums and just beat the crap out of. And she was called as a witness, and the judge would not let the jury witness this witness and hear her testimony. They called it prejudicial. They would have heard horrific testimony from this poor woman who was just a little older than Dominique. In fact, when Dominique was at the day of her funeral, Lillian sat in her car across the street from the church, too afraid to go in. They didn't know each other, but she knew what happened. And anyway, the jury not only missed this horrific testimony that would have explained everything about this man's history of violence, but they also missed when this man, the defendant, felt that his pride was being hurt, didn't want to listen to this anymore, and he stood up and started to leave the courtroom in a huff, and then was wrestled to the ground and fought back against the bailiffs. They only could have seen the rage in his face. This never would have happened. They didn't allow that testimony to be clear to the jury. It's exactly what happened. I was reminded of it very recently. The loophole in a judge's decision is the judge ruled it prejudicial or inadmissible because what the defendant did, no matter how horrific, was not what he was being tried for. If that sounds familiar, that's exactly what the highest court in New York ruled by throwing out Harvey Weinstein's conviction for the exact same thing, for bringing in witnesses that were very effective. But what Harvey did to those people, those women, was not what he was being tried for. So you could throw it all out.
Griffin Dunne's memoir is The Friday Afternoon Club. It is published by Penguin Press. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on national productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening. For The Book Show, I'm Joe Donahue.